here, the aftermath of the DC protest march with
Michael Heaney. I'm an assistant professor of political science and organizational studies at the University of Michigan.
Fantastic. And do you verbally consent to doing this interview?
Yes, I verbally consent to doing this interview.
Awesome. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, your age, where you're from, how you identify, if you do identify?
I am 45 years old. I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but I'm originally from Bayonne, New Jersey. I identify as a straight man.
Great. So what are you doing here today?
I am a professor at the University of Michigan, and I am doing a survey of the participants here today. It's part of a broader project that I'm doing that's looking at protests during the Trump administration.
What are some of your early findings?
Some of the interesting early findings I have are that the protests that we've seen since January have been highly partisan, and in fact they've been more partisan since January than they had been in the decade prior to that. Also, I've got some interesting findings about people's ideas about violence and its uses for political purposes. And one of the interesting findings is that people who participate in these protests are more supportive of political violence than people in the general population. But also at protests, people who identify with a political party are more likely to be supportive or less likely to be supportive of violence than people who are identified with a third party or who are independent.
Interesting. What got you interested in studying the subject?
Well, I got started doing this in 2004 during the Iraq War, and I just got interested because I was angry, and I found myself attending protests and then doing surveys.
Do you think that protests are effective?
Protests are sometimes effective, usually they're not effective.
What leads you to that conclusion?
Well, really the question is whether a protest effectively puts pressure on decision makers. So in order for a protest to make a difference, the people in power have to really feel the heat. I think that one of the reasons they may feel the heat is if people that they consider their constituents are protesting. So it's really important to identify who the constituents are of the person being targeted and try to get those people to turn out.
And so then that would imply that the fact that protests have become more partisan, does that make them less effective?
I do think the fact that protests have become more partisan makes them less effective. I think the number one piece of advice I would give to all the groups that have been protesting against the Trump administration would be to try to find ways to reach out to different groups that are on the other side of the aisle, or people who are independents or people on the other side of the aisle. One of the problems with a protest like, for example, the one today, is that somebody like Donald Trump doesn't expect to get support from this community. And so, basically, when the people that turn out are only people who voted against him, then he doesn't have anything to fear from the protest. So what you really want to do is you want to show him that people he's counting on to vote for him, that those people turn out and protest him.
What do you think is the difference between, say, the protests against Rousseff in Brazil and Proctor in Korea and his protests against Trump in America?
I'm going to have to pass on that one because I'm just not familiar enough with the...
Yeah, I'm bringing out the hard questions. You're
Yeah.
just a professor.
Okay.
So you're from Ann Arbor, but you regularly travel to DC to study protests?
Yes.
Are there protests going on in Ann Arbor as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's protests going on in Ann Arbor and all over Michigan. There's protests going on all over the United States. Unfortunately, for my budget, I can only study some of them, so I've been studying the large protests in Washington, D.C.
Okay. Exclusively the large protests here?
So far.
Okay.
I would like to do some more, I would like to do some decentralized protests that are around the country, but I need to raise a little money before I can do that.
Sure. And what's the common trend that you see in the protests you've been at here in DC? What are some of the things that...
Well, the number one thing I've seen is that they're very, very partisan, and that the protests don't seem to be very strategic in the sense that the leaders of the protests have really thought about having a large protest. They haven't really thought about how will this protest put pressure on the people who are in power. And I think that's an enormous mistake. Like, I think probably the biggest example would be the March for Science, because that would be a really good example of an issue where there's people on both sides of the aisle.
Right.
And, you know, that march was just not able to bring out the conservative constituency in the way that they really need to. Or, I mean, the protest leaders should think about maybe protest isn't the right method. You know, I mean, maybe lobbying or media actions are more the way to put this kind of pressure on.
If you were in charge of the next big protest in Washington, what's the number one thing that would be on your agenda to make it more effective?
Well, the first thing I might do would be not to have it. I think the first thing that I might do would be to try to find other ways to engage decision makers and look for ways to frame, or, you know, if I were going to have a protest, I guess to try to frame the argument in a way that reaches across the aisle, that reaches both sides. Yeah, I'm not sure that just having big protests is going to have the effect that people hope that it will. Now, one effect that it does have is it brings people from certain communities together. So, for example, today's March for Equality plays an important role of bringing the LGBTQIA plus community out and, you know, giving people an opportunity to build solidarity, to network with one another, and that's really important. And that makes a difference. But then you've also got to think strategically about who is this going to pressure? Who is going to feel the heat? Like, a good example of protests that were really effective were the protests at the airports that took place early in the Trump administration during the travel ban. And the fact that they were at the airports, that they were disrupting what was happening at the airports, this really put pressure on decision makers, and that produced results. Like a protest on a Sunday in the park, people taking naps, you know, it doesn't put pressure on anybody.
So you said that you got into this work because you were angry and you were doing protests. Are you still angry?
Well, I'm taking medicine for that.
Is that a joke? Are you serious?
Well, I'm serious. Am I still angry? No, I'm not angry. I think that's an internal state of mind, right? I think that, I mean, I'm very disturbed by what's happening in our country. I'm very, very troubled by what's happening in our country. I'm very concerned about what's happening in our country and worried for the world. But I'm not angry anymore. I think Ani DeFranco has a song like that.
Yeah?
Right? Yeah.
So, and serious question, do you think it's the medication that's making you less angry, or has something changed in the way you view our political process?
No, I think that the medication is helping.
All right, well, congratulations on that then.
All right. Leave that out if you don't mind.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Can do.
All right.
Is there anything else you want to add that I haven't talked about?
Well, I used to be a professor at the University of Florida. So I was a professor there from 2005 to 2009. Go Gators.
Go Gators. All right, thank you so much.